All right, we'll get this thing rolling. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to breakout session number three. It's 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday, and I'm barely awake. So here we go. This session is going to be about the LGBTQ plus workplace inclusion. I'm going to introduce myself. I am the moderator this morning. My name is Ella Michaela Bowman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a retired Maine municipal manager, a retired law enforcement officer, and one of the founding members of the Kennebec Regional Diversity Initiative. I'm proud to be joined here by such an esteemed group of panelists, and this is going to be exciting. I'm bound to learn a lot from this myself. So, Gia, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hey, thanks, Ella, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Gia Drew. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I'm the executive director at Equality Maine, which has been Maine's leading voice on LGBTQ plus rights for 42 years. I've been part of the organization now for about 14 years. I started as a volunteer on the marriage equality campaign in 2012, and now I'm the director. Previously, I was a high school teacher and coach, much of that here in the state of Maine for about 20 years, and bring a lot of my experience working with young people and related to education and wellness to these conversations. And I've done a lot of work in this space around workplace inclusion and been part of this conference since its inception. So I'm glad to be back again this year. Thanks, Ella.
Thank you, Gia. Soren, you're up.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Soren Erwich. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm the school engagement coordinator for Out Maine. So, yes, doing a lot of work making sure we can support our LGBTQ youth. A lot of my work really focuses on making sure that kids have a safe space at school and working with all the people to make that possible. My experience, I've always been part of GSTAs or the LGBTQ clubs that schools have, and just seeing how impactful and positive that was, I wanted to make sure to give back to my community and make sure that kids continue to have such a good experience with that. Thanks for
Awesome.
being here.
Thank you, Soren. Dana.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dana Carver Byaller, she, her pronouns. I serve as the Director of Civil Rights for the Bangor School Department. And you'll hear a little bit of chaos in the background because my children have a delayed start to the day up here in Penobscot County. My background is in higher education in the nonprofit sector. And it was about 6 years ago, I shifted gears into the K-12 realm. And in my role of director of civil rights, I do two different things. So I make sure that we are compliant in terms of public education law and policy for both students and employees. And then I also support students and staff members around cultivating rich culture, climate, and curriculum to ensure that students and staff members feel seen and heard and respected in the classroom. So I'm thrilled to be joining everyone today.
Thank you, Dana. This is awesome. What a group of people we have with us today. It's going to be exciting. So, the way we're going to go through this process, we have a series of 6 questions, and we have selected 1 to 2 of our panelists to answer each question depending on expertise. Actually, they're all qualified to answer all of these. At the end of this question period, we're going to have a question and answer period for our participants. So we're looking forward to hearing some questions that you may have for us. So we're going to get rolling right off. Question number 1. This is going to be directed towards Soren and Gia. Soren, you're up, and Gia, you're going to be on deck. Many leaders want to move beyond polarization and focus on workplace effectiveness. Soren, how can organizations anchor LGBTQ plus inclusion in core business priorities like talent retention, risk management, and performance rather than political framing?
Yeah, great question. So, again, thinking about we know that diversity is a really good business practice. It's really beneficial when we really tie it to business priorities. It's a good one to have, right? We want to make sure that everyone feels safe and included, and we want to make sure we can really foster a space of positive relationships. So, there are a few ways that we can make sure that businesses are really aware of these aspects, like tapping into staff experiences and providing pathways for organizational culture to challenge assumptions, find knowledge gaps, and just halt reproduction in hierarchical systems that pervade society. That's like the next step we should take after education. And like that education piece could look like making some language shifts, make sure there's good resource sharing, experience sharing, and company reflection. We just want to make sure that we can start working on these little pieces. And it's sometimes helpful to start with, like, for example, language shifting, right? Whether that be sharing pronouns in the beginning of meetings or making sure that language is like more broad to include more identities. We can do that on a smaller level so it's a little more manageable, starting with like maybe some cohorts or some small teams, and then you expand that effort. And then lastly, like, we know that organizational culture is best when it's cohesive and enacts strategies of participatory social inclusion. This does help improve performance and reduce turnover. There's a lot of data out there. One of the examples is a lovely paper, The Forgotten Dimension of Diversity. Social class is as important as race or gender. So I highly recommend that one.
So when you mentioned language shift, are you talking like in policies or spoken policies? How are you envisioning that to happen?
Yeah, I think both are great. You know, they have to work concurrently, right? It's a lot easier to. I know some organizations start with a DEIB statement, right? Because now you have this policy that you can hold people accountable to. Hopefully, in that process, you get a sample of the whole organization, so you have everybody's expertise and interests included in that DEIB statement. And then, yeah, that day by day language shifting is really important, right? Just making sure that we use language that makes people feel comfortable. I think oftentimes you have like that term of like the bubbler talk, not that all of us work in person and have a bubbler, right? But a lot of those conversations that happen there do impact company culture. So making sure you can shift that into being more inclusive, just day by day conversations, and then also doing the policy at the same time is really important.
Awesome. Good way of framing that up. Thank you so much for that.
Mhm.
Gio, what do you have to say about this question?
I love the reference to the bubbler first. Just thank you for that, Soren. You know, I grew up in Massachusetts. We called it the bubbler, which is different than like a water cooler or fountain. So thank you, Soren. But you know, Soren brought up some really great points here related to the workplace and how it does need to be more uniform and how important diversity is in attracting a strong, diverse base, but also our customer base too, and having that reflect our communities across here in the state of Maine. You know, one of the things that that I often bring up in conversations with business folks related to LGBTQ, and a lot of folks think it's a very political issue, and it is right now, unfortunately. And you know, business leaders need to understand that each of us have a relationship to someone in the LGBTQ community. Virtually every Mainer has a relationship to someone who's LGBTQ, whether that's a neighbor, a friend, a family member. We all have some relationship to someone who's LGBTQ. So it's not, when we talk about it that way, that each of us have a relationship to this community. It's not othered. And I think that's really important. We also want to emphasize that um, talking about LGBTQ is usually a celebration of who we are as people and not like separating us really dramatically from other people. And it's important to recognize that everybody in the workplace and customers have some sort of quote sexual orientation. And I think it's important to sort of name these things, whether you're LGBTQ or not, you're going to have a relationship to sexual orientation, which has to do with who you love, who you want to spend time with, and things like that. And I think that's really important. This isn't about othering people. This is about making sure we recognize that everybody has different attributes, but also recognizing there's been a really long history of harassment and discrimination against LGBTQ people. That's why it's really important for managers and supervisors and business leaders to pay attention to those things because they don't want those things to grow or fester in the workplace. So it's really important to sort of set the tone. And I love what Soren said about making sure you have a really strong statement on diversity. This is what we believe in, really sets the tone throughout the business, whether you're talking about your customers or your employees. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, I love the comment about othering because you're right. We all want to blend in and do our jobs. And by separating a group of people from the herd, it can make it more difficult. Thank you so much, Gia. Okay, so we're going to move on to question number two, which is addressing workplace harm. This question is going to be directed towards Gia Drew, who's going to start out, and Dana, you'll be on deck on this one. When exclusion shows up through everyday behaviors, not policy, leaders often hesitate to act. What are the most effective ways organizations can identify, address, and correct exclusionary behavior among coworkers without escalating conflict or legal risk? This is a tough one. Gia.
It is a hard one, but I think, in working with businesses in making sure they have, fair plans in place that are clear for all employees of what's expected of them. And when they step not out of line, but maybe go this direction that may be potentially harmful to another employee or to a customer, make sure they're following those steps clearly and they're not singling out somebody because of something unique. It's basically if they are like stepping out of line based on the current expectations of the workplace, that they're following those procedures. I think that is really, really important, but it's also very important to make sure, and this is what we found out here, this hesitancy. We see this everywhere, where managers, supervisors, um, don't know when or how to step into a conversation like this. I think a lot of managers um, don't know the language all that well or are unsure about, terminology related to LGBTQ, and they don't want to offend somebody, and they don't know if wait, is that a slur, or are they just being nice to somebody? And I think it's really important to empower business managers and people with that education so they understand what's the basic terminology is. But it's always important to make sure that your folks are, eager to step in and ask some of those like probing questions. Hey, I heard you speak this way to a staff member, and I'm curious about the way you use that term, for example, queer, because the term queer in today's world can be very affirming to a person if that person identifies as queer. But we also know that queer can be really offensive and derogatory about a person. And so, really empowering managers and supervisors to understand the language as best they can, but also helping them practice this sort of intervention piece. And this is so important that teams work together to support one another in the intervention process. Because sometimes people say things and they don't even realize what they're saying is anti-LGBTQ. It's just something they've maybe grown up with and is part of their culture and community. And they need to be reminded that what they're saying is actually potentially offensive and grounds for some type of administrative, work. And so I think it's really important that we educate people and we practice how do we intervene in these sessions uh, so things don't get bigger and bigger or escalate into something that's really bad for both parties.
Yeah, exactly. And bigger, the growth of an issue is really what destroys a lot of morale within a company. So thank you so much for that. Dana.
Yeah, to build off of that, the first step for me is always how is an organization cultivating a culture of reporting? I think a lot of the times, either with the best of intentions or the worst of intentions, or the other 90% that fall somewhere in between, um, making sure that we're taking that inclusion statement that Soren spoke to and turning it into actionable steps. So making it really clear to all employees, staff members, faculty, whatever the case may be, of this is why this is so important. The good old New York City subway, see something, say something approach. It is so critically important in a school setting. I have their 8.5 by 11 sheets that are adhesive like Post-it notes that I put up in every single bathroom stall. I put up in break rooms of here are the confidential resources for things, ranging from workplace, OSHA concerns, sexual assault reporting, and then who am I and how do you find me? So I think step one is always having an identified person in the organization to go to. Usually it would be someone in human resources, with concerns, and also whatever laws each of your businesses or organizations are beholden to in terms of re-educating staff members in the public education sphere. That looks like annual training around Title IX and non-discrimination law, and then upon new employee hires. So making sure that that's not just that, step by step, module that you encounter online when you're onboarded, but really let people ask questions. Usually smaller group settings seems to work better because it makes absolute sense that when you're getting into questions and issues of identities, LGBTQ and every other potential identity, people most of the time don't want to get it wrong, and they're worried about saying something that will cause harm or be offensive. Or, let's even go with the worst case scenario. You have someone that doesn't particularly care about using inclusive language, but they do care about remaining employed. So at least creating those parameters around, what is or is not appropriate, and giving people the appropriate avenue to ask those questions. I think after, we have really clear expectations and clear avenues for the importance of reporting, the legal obligation to report, and how to report. I think from there, we really build on, okay, what are we doing to make sure that we're following the law? So I think thing one that I would always suggest for any workplace environment is, tagging in your attorney, and making sure that your policies are up to date and aligned with state and federal labor law and employment law. But also recognizing that the way I approach this is the laws and the policies are the floor, not the ceiling of inclusion. So making sure that we're following the law, obviously important, but that's not good enough, right? So really doing the work as an organization to center inclusion and do so bravely and strongly, and even in the face of adversity, because I'm sure, as little as I know every single attendee on right now, I feel certain that if you're here, you are probably aware that identities can be easily politicized. They're not inherently political, but they're politicized. LGBTQ folks know this all too well. And we know that there's like an ebb and flow of what's emphasized, what rights are, on the ballot or coming up in the Supreme Court. So staff knowing that their employer is steadfastly committed to this work, and to making sure everyone feels seen and heard, and that employees recognize that diversity is indeed a strength and a good business model, I think goes a long way. And then to circle this back to the question, when there is harm caused, what do we do with that and how do we navigate that? And I think thing one is to believe the impact. You don't have to necessarily have the same lived experience as a staff member to empathize that when they come to you and say that this thing happened and it made me feel uncomfortable or it made me feel isolated, to believe them, because you can't measure impact necessarily, and to recognize that impact and intention may not be the same thing, and if they're not the same thing, to really center the person who reported that harm and experienced that harm, to help them navigate in a way that they're comfortable with, what that looks like. Also recognizing that sometimes things that, if there's mandated reporting around something, you got to do what you got to do, but really to keep the parties involved in the process so they know what's going on and they can help to navigate and inform when it's appropriate what those interventions are.
You're muted, Ella.
Yeah, I just saw that. Thank you, Gia. That was a great answer, Dana. Thank you so much for that. Both of you did great on that. Okay, so question number 3 is going to be directed towards Gia. Data privacy and trust. Human resource leaders struggle with what to collect, track, communicate. What data should organizations responsibly gather to improve inclusive or inclusion outcomes, and what information should remain confidential and protect the employees? Gia.
That's a lot, Ella. So before I even dive into that, one of the things that Dana was just talking about was sort of making sure everyone understands what the current laws are for related to employment here in Maine, which are state laws and federal laws. And it's always, important that everyone sort of understands what those look like. And they're not always listed on those posters, the labor posters that are posted in the staff room. And it's important for folks to really understand that while there may have been political shifts over the last year or two, the laws related to employment here in the state of Maine or across the country in terms of federal laws have not changed. And I think that's always a really important reminder that here in the state of Maine, we were one of the first states 21 years ago uh, to make sure that LGBTQ people are protected from discrimination in the workplace. And that is the bedrock of the Maine Human Rights Act, is to make sure that LGBTQ plus people or people perceived to be LGBTQ are protected from harassment in the workplace. And that is clear in Maine law. And the Supreme Court ruled about 4 or 5 years ago that nationally, you cannot discriminate based on LGBTQ in the workplace as well. And so we do have these sort of bedrock. I like that phrasing, Dana, that's the floor, that we have these laws and policies in place for a reason. We want to make sure that everyone can come to work and be themselves and not fear for harassment and bullying in the workplace. And so that's a really important place to start. But I will say, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm definitely not an HR professional. And so there are specific things I've learned as a leader, and I run the nonprofit here, and I act as the HR person on staff here. So I've had to go through my own training to understand what is best practice when you're collecting data from. How do on an application for a job, what kind of questions am I allowed to ask in that process and things related to that? And then all the different documentation uh, things you need to collect to prove that you're eligible to work here in this country, like the I-9 form and things related to that. I think being really clear, knowing what you're allowed to collect and what kind of questions you can ask of anybody during the sort of interview process is really important, for sure. One of the things that gets a little complicated is the HR portion, and I've run into bumps in the road related to benefits, for example, when someone has accepted a position and there's this whole checklist of things you have to collect from somebody. Some of those things may have sensitive information in that could be someone's previous name. It could be uh, a gender marker on identification that they've turned into when you fill out the I-9 form or something like that. And I think it's really important for business leaders and folks in HR is to recognize and inform people that the information that they are collecting in that process is confidential. And that it's not going to be shared out with the rest of the team. It's not going to be shared out with the rest of the staff. And that's really important as an HR person, is you have to do your job, and you have to collect this information. And sometimes you may have to collect information that isn't the most exciting thing to fill out, because sometimes you have to fill out information that isn't your paperwork. Like for health insurance, it's usually from either a provider or maybe a broker who is giving you this information, and they're asking information that you wouldn't normally ask your employee related to their sex and their gender, their age, and some other things. But in terms of insurance plans and things like that, you may be asking some sensitive information. Of course, that information is to be kept confidential. It's not to be shared out with the rest of the team. And I think those types of things are really important for business leaders and HR professionals should be aware of. One of the areas that we've run into a little more recently here with a couple employers here in the state of Maine is, when is it appropriate to actually ask questions to someone's demographics? And there's always a sort of that following survey. And most of us have gotten that follow-up survey. It used to be a postcard back in the old days, but now you sort of you've applied for this job and you get this. This won't be attached to your application. It will not affect your employment, but there is a way to track, make sure that different employee sectors are tracking demographic data related to race, ethnicity, and sometimes they have questions around sexual orientation and gender identity. It's important to make sure that there is a distinction between those questions. Those questions are always optional on those, and those will not be ever connected to the applicant in that process of getting a job. And so it's very important that folks who do ask for those things make it clear that those are optional and they're never connected to the applicant's ability to get a job. So I know that's a lot. And so I'm going to pause for a second to see if Ella, you had a follow-up question. You're still muted, Ella.
Thank you, Gia. The
It's okay.
question on optional. So are you suggesting that an HR person is okay to ask somebody who might be gay or transgender if they are?
Not in the interview process. No, that's against the law here in the state of Maine, and asking
Right.
anything related to someone's sexual orientation or gender identity in the process or even during the workday. It's nobody's business unless you bring it up. And that's perfectly fine to bring up your own, like who you are and things like that in the workplace. Absolutely. But and you should never be asked by a supervisor, manager about what your sexual orientation is or gender identity is in terms of like workplace, because that really has nothing to do with your performance. And that's not why you were hired. Because
Right.
when you look at the job descriptions of these jobs, it's not about your sexual orientation and gender identity. It's about the skills and things you bring to the employer. And so,
Exactly.
right. But you're more than welcome to say, talk about who you are as a person for sure.
Okay. All right. So is there any point in time where you feel that it would be permissible for an employee to ask somebody who works there if they are gay or transgender?
I think what employers could do to get a better sense is not direct questions like that, but they definitely can do surveys that are anonymous of their employees to get a better sense of like, I wonder, how many people are this part of this group or that to make sure that they are trying to cultivate a really wonderful, robust, and diverse workforce. You absolutely can look at data that is collected generally across the state. And you can do anonymous surveys about your employees to
Right.
get a better sense of how are we doing making sure that we're attracting and retaining employees from different diverse backgrounds. But again, it can never be connected to a specific person unless that person is open about who they are.
And that a lot of the times that happens. If somebody comes out in the workplace as trans, that becomes public knowledge, and then you're going to be dealing with a whole different bunch of questions because of that.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and I want to emphasize. So, for example, when someone transitions on the job, that's one thing. And so there may be the idea that, oh, that person came out, it is now going by Ms. Drew instead of Mr. Drew. And I went through that process. And, we made it clear that if people had questions about what's going on, they weren't going to go to the employee and ask, hey, Gia, what's going on in your blah, blah, blah. That really is for the HR person or the supervisor or manager to answer those questions rather than, imposing on the employee of
Right.
what's going on in their life. Because it's a very private thing for that person. But sometimes the employee says, no, it's okay. People can ask me what's going on. I don't care. And so making sure you get that consent from the employee about if the other employees have questions about why their name changed from Mr. Drew to Miss Drew, sure. And that's going to happen in so many different ways in the workplace. People change their name frequently. People get married, people get divorced, whatever. People change their names. It doesn't really change like who they are as a person. It doesn't change their performance in the workplace either. And so it's important to make sure that supervisors and managers understand, for example, if someone does transition on the job, about what that person wants to keep confidential about who they are as a person, versus what can be shared to the rest of the team.
This is exactly when good workplace policies, personnel policies, anti-harassment policies need to be established in the workplace. And a lot of the smaller companies don't have this type of paperwork in front of them. Your larger companies do a good job with this. And that backs us back up to question number three about the exclusion. So this scenario running could go all day long. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise in this area. That was a great answer. So we're going to move on to question number four. This question is going to be directed towards Soren and Dana. Soren, you're going to be starting out. Dana, you're going to be on deck. In school and youth serving environments, multiple stakeholders are involved. And we know that more now than we have before. What does an effective support model look like for LGBTQ plus students, including clarity on roles, communication, boundaries and decision-making authority? This is a tough one. Soren.
Yeah, I think creating like a holistic approach, making sure you can capture everything that's coming into contact with those LGBTQ students is really important. So like whether that be being aware and like providing pathways for like support systems for all students. Again, like a lot of these times, and I think Gia, you made this point earlier about like sexual orientation, is sometimes it comes up when it's a gay person rather than when someone is heterosexual, right? Because we live in a society where it's a heteronormative society, so it doesn't feel as out of place. But these systems help more than just like people that identify as LGBTQ. There's lots of ways that we can make sure that our systems are supportive for like I don't know, making sure like LGBTQ students whose families are also LGBTQ. When you make a supportive system for that different family dynamic, it's also helping kids who have parents that's maybe a single parent, maybe it's a grandparent, maybe it's somebody that's not even blood related, right? So again, like thinking about how can we connect our stories together and make systems that really support everyone. I think another way to support LGBTQ students is making sure there are mentoring opportunities. So whether that be from the adults or some older students, making sure that they're connected to other students or faculty members who they might not have had experience with or might not have originally interacted with can really help, remind everyone that these are just kids, this is part of their identity. And also like, let's connect with them and see how we can support them better, learn about their lived experience. Another way, thinking about like clarity on roles and we can think about where kids can share their identities, right? If kids do want to share their identity with the school, making sure that there's a way for youth to share their identity in a way that lessens the burden on them is really important. I know some schools that I've worked with have started using a transgender slash like gender expansive support plan, which outline basic student information, confidentiality, and student safety. And a document like this can help ensure that students have the correct information in the right places, a clear support system, and like a pre-planned check-in time to make sure that the student feels safe and supported. Like that's some kids come into schools already identifying as like say non-binary, right? So that might be a great place to enact that support plan. Some kids transition while they're at school, right? And like in their whole lives, but obviously they have to tell their school community and they want control over how they share that information. So that could be helpful. Having clear language and of support in program handbooks or school handbooks. I again like thinking about where can you make it clear, and in the beginning of the year, like these kids and families are signing on to this program, and we want to make sure that we're cultivating a safe environment for these kids. The more clear the language is in that handbook, the more obvious it's going to be for the kids that are participating and are maybe nervous to start school here, or maybe nervous to go to this youth program, right? LGBTQIA plus students like are very aware of the political attack on them right now. So having that language can ensure that like, oh, I can go to this program. Like they'll actually protect me here. We don't know what their experience has been prior to that. So I think that a handbook can be really helpful for that. And then last note on that, making sure that registration forms that's another great place where you can be really inclusive. I know like Outmain, we have a guide specifically that has some of those questions. And, again, like this is really helpful for when families and kids are all on the same page and they want to make sure that that information is clear, their lodging is clear. And again, like they have a good support system throughout that program. So yeah, I would say just making sure it's holistic, right? We want to make sure that we're giving specific structures for the kid on their own, giving a bigger structure for the program itself, and then making sure that there's the least amount of barriers possible for kids to share information with faculty to make sure that, okay, like I do feel safe here, I do feel supported. And if not, like what does action look like to support that kid?
Excellent answer. That's a tough question. Dana.
Yes, I feel like you totally covered it. We're good to move on. No, but mirroring everything Soren just said, I think it's a multi-prong approach. There's never like I know our next topic I'm sure we'll shift into is around training. It's never a one and done with any of this stuff. So I think the most important piece is Of course, training is frequently on the job. You don't know what you're getting into until you're establishing that muscle memory of getting used to being in a new educational environment or after school program or whatever the case may be. But the foundational pieces, and don't assume everyone knows everything, right? So I say this from the perspective of having lived in very, very different states and very different parts of states. So, the acronyms, I think frequently in inclusive spaces across the board, and certainly the LGBTQ plus realm, we like our acronyms. We have lots of shortened versions of things that can be exclusionary. And I think that starts when we start getting into LGBTQ and DEIB. I mean, you're going to lose people, and people are going to not feel as comfortable asking questions. So I think from that beginning, and then that annual training before students come back to you, if you're on a school year schedule, what are pronouns? Why are they important? How reviewing data of, because we don't need to necessarily poll, going to Gia's previous question, we don't need to necessarily poll students and families and over ask questions if we already have access to that data. So being really thoughtful and meaningful about like, what are we asking and why do we need that information? Like a good example is, like the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey, or MIAS. There's certainly no perfect, way to capture all the information you want, but a data collection mechanism like that gives us really good information in terms of, by district, by school, by county, and by state, how many students do identify as LGBTQ. So really knowing and being able to communicate to your staff, what are our demographics and why does that matter, I think is a really important starting place. I think from there, having, policies that are student facing, as neutral and accessible as possible is really, really important. So a good example of that I could think of are dress codes. There's no reason why dress codes need to be, and quite frankly, it's not legally compliant for dress codes to say X applies to girls or Y, applies to boys for multiple reasons, but rather like what are the aspects of your dress code that are important, and why, and that it's applicable across the board. So doesn't matter whose body is underneath said clothes. It's if there's a safety mechanism, and that could be something as easy as you can't have excessively baggy clothes if you're working in a science lab with open flames. You can't have cleats on, the tiles, because you will destroy our floors, and taxpayers don't want that add on to the budget. Things like that. And obviously it gets more complex with identities, but making sure policies are really neutral. And also, I say this all the time, policies are only as good as how educated people are around them. So whether you're in a corporate space or education space or a nonprofit space, we can have thousands, and we frequently do, of policies. And if students have never heard the phrase, the Bangor High School handbook, how are we possibly going to hold them accountable to that handbook, right? So making sure that, we're actually, meaningfully educating people around what the expectations are, and that this is a big deal thing. So then when, not unfortunately if, but when there, maybe a problem, we could point to like, hey, do you remember your freshman class meeting? You met me, I went over all these things. So like, we know better, we got to do better type of thing. From there, I would say, how do we help students? Representation matters. To borrow one of my favorite phrases from English teachers, the opportunities for mirrors and windows. So really making sure students have the ability in every and any setting to see different worldviews, experience different perspectives and lived experiences, but also see themselves embedded in the work that we do in real ways, not symbolic, quick ways. But really see the meaning behind that. And I can, for a personal share, there's a difference for me having been one of very few Jewish kids in a predominantly, Christian Catholic community growing up. There's only so many times one can read the excerpts from the Diary of Anne Frank, a very important text, but having it be more meaningful and not having identities be relegated to a part of history or a textbook or a political event, I think is really important for students. And the mentorship piece is really important. Mentors in the community, and mentors in terms of how do we attract and hire and retain diverse staff? Because in any setting, I would argue staff should be a good representation of the demographics within a community. So for instance, if you have, 24% of, your community is BIPOC identified, and you have a staff that is 4% BIPOC identified, what's going on there? And it's something to explore. And that's not an easy lift. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak, within a setting like this, that hiring and retaining a diverse workforce, however we measure diversity, is challenging, especially the further up north we get in this beautiful state. But really making sure that students have that representation. I could talk about this for hours, but the last piece that I think is important is when we have new students coming in, whether it's, new students that are graduating up to the next school or moving into the area, really like a good student onboarding. So if students, and I found overwhelmingly students and their grownups, don't hesitate to identify, and plan ahead of time, because unfortunately, students know, and their grown-ups that love them and care for them know, that LGBTQ youth are an incredibly vulnerable student population, for harm, for bullying, for poor academic outcomes, for so many adverse events. And the best antidote to that is them walking into school and feeling seen and respected and celebrated, right? So whether it's a matter of answering questions, reviewing school layout, answering questions around, changing areas, bathrooms, and just having the family take the lead. If their student wants to know where the single stall bathrooms are, great. If students want to know where congregate bathrooms are, great as well. Who are the point people to talk to, and how do they want their identity, archived in our databases? So making sure you have a crystal clear plan of listing preferred names whenever possible. And I make it very clear to our students and our staff that we will list pronouns on our student information system, and have preferred names always preferred names are the default, except in the few occasions of legal documents where we have to list legal names. And when there are updates, putting the labor on the grown-ups that are paid to be at school every day and not the students who are there to be learners, is really important. So I'm the person that manages, for instance, all of the name and pronoun updates. We have a really clear protocol, because I don't want staff getting it wrong. I don't want staff messing up our database. So it's a really clear plan for students and their grownups to reach out, let me know what the updates are. I make those updates based on, what they're interested in seeing change. And then I communicate out to our staff. And it's not a whole staff. It's a who needs to know, who's working with your student. And just, it's a 3-sentence email. And if anyone's interested, I'm always happy. Please follow up with me after this, and I would be more than happy to hand off, and you can copy and modify what I do. Just a quick, the subject line is student update, and it's, hi, reaching out about this student that you work with. Student has requested that moving forward, we refer to them with this name and these pronouns. And then I always make a point of saying, if you have any questions about preferred names, pronouns, or LGBTQ identity, please ask me those questions. If you have any other questions that are specific to the student would be more than happy to answer. But again, sort of differentiating, it's not the student's job to be the educator. If students feel really excited and proud and want to share that identity, awesome. No different than staff members, like, what Gia had spoken to. Like I have children that will be more than happy in there being magically quiet right now, which I'm very thrilled about. They're in kindergarten and second grade. Going into June, they will happily educate everyone that will listen to them about what Pride Month means, like including the tough stuff. And that's wonderful. That's very different than a teacher turning to one of my kids and saying, "Oh, Rowan and Harper, you have two moms. Why don't you tell us what that's like?" That's don't do that. You don't want to tokenize your staff or your students, but to empower them and elevate them if they want to share that. It can be a really enriching, amazing experience for kids and families as well. So it's always a balance.
That's amazing. A lot of material just was shared there. Thank you so much. No, it's awesome. So we're going to move on to question number 5, training. This is going to be directed towards Dana. You're up first, and Soren, you're on deck. What is the best workplace training you have been part for LGBTQ workplace inclusion, and what was unique about it, Dana?
So I'll keep it really short because I felt like that was very long that I previously was chatting to. The biggest thing for me is the again the choice and voice piece of being responsive to your staff. So trainings, it's a double-edged sword. Everyone wants more trainings, and then when they're in trainings, they're complaining about being in the trainings. So it's a balance for me of giving staff getting staff feedback ahead of time of what for the setting that I work in. What are your biggest needs? What are you seeing in classrooms? What do you feel less comfortable about? What do you need to learn more about? Bangor was a designated refugee resettlement zone 4 or 5 years ago. So we had a huge influx of refugee and asylum seeking families, which have created such an amazing, rich extra layer to our community that also required increased cultural competency for good reason. So, identifying, for instance, what areas to focus on, really important, and giving people multiple avenues. The best training that I was proudest to contribute to was it was set up like conference style, similar to this, of giving people opportunities to seek out different areas of expertise. Of course, most people aren't going to stretch themselves and they're going to pick what they're most comfortable with. But I believe strongly that starting with even if it's safer and more comfortable, if you're creating a robust, training opportunities, getting buy-in from your staff is so important, or they're just going to shut down, especially if you work with, staff that may be more resistant to inclusive workplace stuff. I think from there, giving people the opportunity, the best trainings that I've both been a part of or helped to organize, giving people the opportunity to really self-reflect and self-assess, whether that's doing a library audit of their curriculum and really taking a step back to say, like, whoa, the majority or all of the texts that we read are by one very specific majority demographic. Goes a long way, giving people the ability, working with psychologists around implicit bias, and people that can really get into like the brain chemistry stuff that's so out of my wheelhouse, and I love learning that. So just giving people the opportunity to learn things that they can really operationalize.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Soren, you're up.
All right, I'm going to gush because I am doing my master's in diversity leadership. So now I have resources for you all, and I'm almost done. So here we go. But when I think of doing the best like workplace training, we do a cohort system with Outmain called the Safe School Cohort. And we do climate analysis surveys for the school itself. We get a lot of data. It's LGBTQIA identities as well as like racial identities and disability as well. So you get like a good spread of what is actually happening in your school. Because yeah, that MIAS data is really good, but the farthest down you can go is county-wise. And then you can go into specific like racial identities. You can go into specific ages. You can go into LGBTQIA. You can even go like heterosexual, gay, and like you could break it out that way. But it's worked really well with schools in terms of being like, no, this is like what your staff are seeing. And the staff do it. The kids don't do it. which I think is helpful as well for understanding where people are at in their stages of learning how to be more inclusive and more supportive. Because yes, there's always going to be different levels of understanding in that process. And some people feel like they go out of their way outside of work to learn more. And some people are not willing to do that work. And regardless, we have to make sure that we can meet them all where they're at in different stages of that process. So one thing that I find really good for doing like a wide climate data analysis is that you can do some goal setting based off of that when we think about our workplace inclusion. And throughout that process, it's always important to think of like, are the measures that we're using like comprehensive or like too focused? Are they centered on the whole organization, a team, a leader, or an individual? I'm going to drop this resource in the chat right now. This is the or if you go down to page 8, this is a library that was using this model called the Multicultural Organization Development Model. So MCOD, I'll just call it that. But if you scroll down to like the 8th page on this resource, and you can look at it later too, it talks about like how organizations are looking in their process, right? Are they more monocultural right now? Are they in the step of like non-discriminating? Are they really truly at that multicultural level? And the thing I find very cool about this is like, we do this process, every organization's at a different stage. We can always do better, right? Again, like Dana said, there is the floor, but this is not the ceiling. We can go and do so much more. And when we look at this practice of like exclusionary values or like one group is dominant, move this towards multicultural, again, like there is a lot of value there. When you start like supporting and really advocating for different identities, like those people are going to feel way more comfortable at your workplace, and they're going to feel way more inclined to do hard work, to, share themselves with the organization, to stay working there. Right. So I think that using this model, the MCOD model, is a really good way to look at an organization as a whole and figure out where these pitfalls are in your process of becoming more inclusive. And then another thing is just like training sessions are always helpful. There's always going to be different levels of buy-in in that process. Something that's really important with those training sessions, though, is that they're followed up with other work, right? That one-off training session's not going to shift the culture of the organization. So what are you going to learn from your training session, and how can you integrate that long-term and you actively work on that? You don't have to do every single piece that organization might have brought to your training or did that original training with. Just start one by one. Again, like that's how you're going to get like that slow process. You could be really intentional. And sometimes people will get frustrated with how slow it's going. That's a hard feeling to manage. But again, we want to make sure that everybody feels like they're learning at the same rate, or like learning and getting to those checkpoints together. And then lastly, with working with the schools in Cumberland doing the Safe School cohort, another thing I've seen is like connecting student leadership with the adults, right? So, okay, they know that we're working with this climate data, and they know what they're seeing in school every single day. They're hearing that language that us adults might miss, right? When we give students the opportunity to share their concerns and dreams for their community, we're giving them that agency. We're teaching them that they could be stewards in creating a community that they find accepting. And so I think really the adults have to do their own work, right? In making sure that we do like that broad approach, and we can help all the other adults learn. We want to make sure that we can help the students learn, but also like tapping into those youth leaders and like really growing their skills in advocating for how they want their community to change is really helpful as well.
Awesome. So we are quickly running out of time. We have 5 minutes left. I don't think we're going to have enough time to actually go through question number 6. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to have some questions answered? If you do, please drop it in a chat and we'll get to them one by one. While that's happening, maybe I will go through question number 6 while the questions are coming in. Question number 6, retention and early warning signs. This question is going to be directed towards Gia and Dana. What's one early warning sign, something a manager can see that an LGBTQ plus employee is disengaging or at the risk of leaving? Gia.
Thank you. I know there's going to be some questions in the chat, so I'll keep this brief. I think probably the first sign that someone may be disengaging is how they're relating to their coworkers. Are they not participating in staff events and things like that? I think that's usually a telltale sign that they feel comfortable with their coworkers or their staff mates. If they're retreating and they're not participating as much as maybe they used to. I think that's a really significant for a supervisor or a manager. And I think it's important. I love listening to Soren and Dana talk about all these different wonderful ways we can engage folks and make policies. And I think the data is really important to recognize too. Here in the state of Maine, about 8% of adults say they're LGBTQ plus, and that's again really important to recognize as an employer, but also that's your customer base too. And we also know that between 20 and 25% of all teenagers in the state of Maine also identify as LGBTQ. And it's really important to recognize, again, this is the future workforce, but also your as well, recognize that these are important uh, fabrics in all businesses across the state of Maine. I did just put in the chat um, a resource. It's the HRC Corporate Equality Index. Human Rights Campaign does a sort of a really glowing report or deep dive into businesses and what are best practices. Here in the state of Maine, we have a few employers that have participated that are really proud of what they're doing in the workplace to make it a very attractive place to work. And so there's more information there, but I want to stop because we only have a few minutes and it looks like there's some questions.
Okay, so we're going to start off. This one here is actually from uh, Raina Winters. A lot of answers today involve record keeping, surveys, etc. What would you advise we do to reinforce the safety of this private data for individuals who are afraid of records being leaked, seized, or otherwise used against them? Anybody want to take a stab at that? All right, Soren.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned, right, was that transgender, gender expansive student policy. I know that putting that with like our mental health staff is a good way to put it behind some extra barriers, right? Making sure that like where can HIPAA and FERPA protect you? That's a good place. And then also thinking about like, does it have to be on record? Do you like just have it as a piece of paper? Like then you don't have to worry about it being online and everything like that. But some of these conversations like can require a physical piece of paper. Some like you really don't need to. It's kind of up to your organization to decide, and also like up to the people involved in that process as well. Like if it's a student sharing that information, they might not want it written down anywhere, right? Maybe they're just coming out in a small group at school and they just want it to be information for that group of people. And you might have a conversation about it anyways, right? But we want to make sure that, okay, this is just information for me, the trusted adult, and your group of friends. I'm not going to write it down anywhere. If someone else asks me about it, how do you want me to navigate that? And that's the end of that story.
Okay. Anybody else like to take a hit at that?
I can build
Dana.
off of that really quickly because I think it also links back to the previous question of keeping LGBTQ staff engaged, letting staff know that that you are invested in them and invested in recognizing for good or bad, and in this case bad, that they are a vulnerable identity, and a vulnerable demographic, and that to not be surprised if a staff member finds you, and makes it clear that they are uncomfortable or they're scared. I think that that's really important, and to only keep data that you need. Like there's no reason, unless you have a very clear one, to track data specific to staff members, and to let staff members know that like you are committed to best understanding if policies or laws change, what that means for them, and that you will be in constant communication with transparency. Like there are lots of things in public education that I don't like, but I will make it clear that for my school district, we're not breaking the laws. And for my students and staff, if a law or policy makes their life more stressful, I will do my best to transparently navigate that with them, alongside them. And I think that just staff knowing that you're in their corner and you recognize things, and it goes across every identity. If if it's a matter of sharing information for, Ramadan, when Ramadan just came up, making sure staff understand how that might look for their students and their staff who celebrate. Just making sure that staff feel seen is what it boils down to.
Awesome. And we have a message from John McClain to the group. Love this panel last year, and you did it again this year. You all do amazing work and have such wonderful insights and advice. Thank you for your time. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. Our time is up. We're at 10 o'clock on the nose here. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to this amazing panel. You guys did amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
I know people are dropping out, but I'm gonna put the resources that I was talking about during my
Okay.
points because I love citing my sources.
I also wish I had shared just in terms of what we can do. Like I just like look down at my badge and just even having like these like I give these pins out, the like, you're safe with me pins. I feel like I notice so frequently students will look down and smile or caregivers will be like, that's awesome. Just like little things like that. I wish I mentioned
Mhm.
that, but
And that is important. I love it when I go to a store and I find a sticker on the door that says LGBTQ welcome here.
yeah.
It really sends a strong message. Anything like that makes a big difference.
Mhm.
I
Uh,
agree. This was great. You all are wonderful.
and so aren't
Mhm.
you. Thank you,
Right
Gia,
back
for
at ya.
inviting me.
Thank
All
you.
Mhm.
right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm out of here.
Have a good one.
You too.
Happy
Thank you.
Friday, y'all.
Yeah, it's nice
All right.
Happy
meeting
Friday.
everybody.
We earned it.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.